Bona tarda a tothom. Estem en aquesta sessió sobre els models europeus d'acollida i inclusió social de la immigració. Abans de començar aquesta conversa, que serà en anglès, deixeu-me que digui unes primeres paraules. Havia de ser una conversa amb Jan Willem Douwendag i Christophe Bertossi, però al final el professor Douwendag no ha pogut venir per raons personals d'última hora, amb la qual cosa ho hem convertit en una conversa entre Christophe Bertossi i jo mateixa. Estem en un moment on la immigració està a tot arreu. Vaig mirant el Christophe perquè imagino que m'entendrà també una mica en català. La immigració està en els debats parlamentaris, ho vam veure dimecres passat al Congrés dels Diputats. La immigració també està en les disputes entre comunitats autònomes, ho veiem setmanalment en aquestes discussions sobre els menors no acompanyats a les Illes Canàries. També la immigració està molt present a les enquestes d'opinió i està constantment als mitjans de comunicació. De fet, aquesta setmana hem vist com El País i la SER publicaven una enquesta que posava en evidència una vegada més com creix la preocupació per la immigració i acompanyant la informació d'aquesta enquesta hi havia un article que es titulava Fins a quin punt no estàvem despertant d'un somni. El somni de ser un país inclusiu, solidari i diferent a la resta de països europeus. I aquest titular em va cridar l'atenció perquè a més em va recordar el titular d'un diari holandès, el Volkskrant, el dia després de l'assassinat de Theo van Gogh, l'any 2004, i el Volkskrant va titular en portada la primera notícia amb el titular Trouble in Paradise, i era una pregunta. I en aquell moment, i era el 2004, jo estava a Amsterdam en aquells moments, la pregunta era si aquell país que ells percebien com un paradís, paradís de la inclusió, del multiculturalisme, de la llibertat i sobretot de la tolerància molt a la holandesa, fins a quin punt havia deixat de ser allò que pensava. Tornant al context espanyol, l'atemptat de Totxa del 2004 no va representar un despertar, com podia haver sigut. L'atemptat a Barcelona del 2017 tampoc va representar aquest despertar. Ningú a Catalunya, a Barcelona i a Espanya va declarar la guerra al terror, com sí va passar a França els mateixos anys, però ara, en canvi, actualment sí veiem aquestes alarmes que van apareixent constantment. En tots aquests debats, el que ens falta és context, el que ens falta és justament perspectiva històrica, el que ens falta és pausa, parar, pensar, reflexionar conjuntament per no sobrereaccionar o estar constantment reaccionant. I això justament és el que hem volgut fer avui aquí, amb aquesta conversa. Quan el Xavier Fina m'ho va proposar, de seguida van sortir els noms de Christophe Bertossi i Jan Willem Douwendag. Malauradament, com us deia, Jan Willem Douwendag no pot estar aquí avui amb nosaltres per raons personals d'última hora, però ho hem convertit en una conversa de tu a tu directament. Abans que comenci la conversa, que serà de nou, com dèiem, en anglès, deixeu-me que ens presenti. Christophe Bertossi és professor a Sciences Po des del 2006, és director de l'Institut per la Democràcia, ha sigut professor visitant en moltes institucions acadèmiques, a la Universitat de Warwick, a la Universitat de Nova York, a la Universitat de Lió, a l'Institut Max Planck, a Göttingen, i ha treballat i ha escrit i ha publicat sobre molts temes relacionats amb la immigració, sobre ciutadania, sobre polítiques d'integració, sobre polítiques d'antidiscriminació, sobre models nacionals d'integració i sobre la resposta dels estats a la població, als ciutadans musulmans, això entre moltes d'altres qüestions, i sempre ho ha fet des d'una perspectiva comparada. Jo diria que és perquè és quan comparem que som capaços d'explicar, i en el seu cas s'ha centrat sobretot en els casos de França, Regne Unit i els Països Baixos. Em presento, jo soc Blanca Garcés, soc investigadora en migracions del CIDOB, que és el Centre d'Investigacions en Relacions Internacionals de Barcelona, i des de fa més de 20 anys em dedico sobretot a l'anàlisi de les polítiques migratòries en temes tan variats com la immigració irregular, qüestions de frontera, qüestions de migracions laborals, temes d'asil, temes d'integració i sempre també, com en el cas de Christophe, Bertossi, des d'una perspectiva comparada. En el meu cas, especialment centrant-me en els casos espanyol i holandès. Dit això, let me shift to English. Thanks to the translators as well. Thanks, Christophe, for being here. Thanks for having come all the way to Barcelona, for being part of la Biennal del Pensament, de Pensament. Let me start with a simple question.
I just have to thank you also for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very sorry I don't speak Catalan, but I've just discovered I understand it a bit.
You could understand me, right? So that's what I thought, and that's why I was looking at you all the time. And I spoke a little bit.
So I apologize, I have to speak English.
So let me start with a simple question, and the question is, how did we arrive here? In the last years, we have seen what we could call the unthinkable, the unbelievable. We have seen the EU external borders becoming spaces of exception with no legal guarantees, with unlawful practices of detention and deportation. We have seen illegal pushbacks all the time. We have seen as well the possibility of derogating fundamental laws in context of alleged crisis. Within Europe, we have also seen governments passing laws that restrict foreign resident rights, fundamental rights, such as the right to live with your family. We have seen as well situations of detention of asylum seekers, de facto detention of asylum seekers. We have heard claims about massive deportations, also in Germany, where the word deportation is a big word. We have seen as well the confiscation of valuable personal things, mostly a couple of jewelries, to migrants or asylum seekers as a way to make them contribute to their reception cost. That has happened in Denmark. We have seen as well plans to deport asylum seekers and to offshore their asylum applications in places such as Rwanda and Albania. We have seen as well thousands of people dying or drowning in the sea every year. This is more than in the war in Ukraine. In many cases, because the Coast Guards from the European side did not respond to their alarm or did not respond on time. We have also seen increasing violence against migrants. For instance, this summer in the UK, during 10 days, we saw images of outright pogroms against immigrant refugees, members of the Muslim community, and racialized people. So here, my question, how did we arrive here? Why? What did it happen? What is common in all these events, narratives, policy responses, and also across different national contexts?
Well, if it was the short and easy question, I'm scared of what happens next. I think all these events, reactions, sensitivity about immigration and diversity among the global northern societies can be summarized by a gap between the reality of the societies we live in, on the one part, and these societies are depending on how the world is structured, and international population mobility is part of the structure of today's world. That's the reality. That's the world we live in. There is no plan B. We don't have the choice. We like it, we don't like it, but we live in a world of international migration, and it has been so since at least the end of the Cold War, but previous periods have also showed that migration is something that is part of the history of the world. So that's the one side of the issue. And the other side of the issue is that there have been more and more controversies in public and political debates on immigration, on the place of migrants in European or Northern American societies. And these controversies, they have led us to a very dangerous question, which is, in the end, what is the cultural identity of the nation? Mm-hmm. And of course, when you ask this question, you don't expect from those who ask this question to have an open answer, an inclusive answer, an answer based on the emancipation of everyone, etc., etc. When you ask the question about what is the cultural identity of the nation, you engage, you address your public opinion, and create the sensitivity we know. So it's a kind of a never-ending, very toxic spiral where we don't have the choice but to live with migration, and that's who we are. But there are these narratives that tell us migrants are endangering your style of life, your access to labor, your economic success.
Mm-hmm. This leads me to the notion of nativism. Christophe has written a lot on nativism. He published this book in 2021, together with Aurélien Taché and Jan Willem Douwendijk, who had to be here today. And here you trace the emergence of the notion of nativism, particularly with regard to the Dutch and French cases. And you define nativism as that idea according to which natives should have more rights and more privilege than those arrived more recently. So, in short, nativism allows or justifies to class society according to people's order of arrival and people's cultural proximity. And in this book, you also show how, in parallel, as part of this process, citizenship becomes increasingly culturalized. So the question is, how did it happen? What is the genealogy of this notion? And how did it come that it happened in different countries, with different national traditions, with different definitions of this nation, this us, at the same time?
Well, if you look at the macro picture, you have two explanations of why we have been put into that narrative about nativism, which you just resumed here, which is a hierarchy among citizens. And being a citizen is not enough to be recognized as a fully fledged citizen, which is a rupture within the link of democracy. I think the first factor that we have to bear in mind is we live in a globalized world, and states lose control about many aspects, the economy, and more of the big issues today are global issues. I mean, the climate change, environment, migration, etc. And states are overwhelmed by this global thing, and they just try to demonstrate to their citizenry, to their audience, to their public opinion, that they still have some capability to get power. Mm-hmm. So they don't have power, but they want to pretend they have power, and the easiest way is to focus on identity issues and control immigration, control border control, etc. But then you have a second factor, which is combined. You have very powerful capitalistic forces that have transformed the relationship between distribution and recognition, if I could put it so, in that way. Today, labor is less valuable than finance. The worth of the labor is less important than the worth of the financial worth. And I think it's a breakout from the post-war compromise about the welfare state. So we've been speaking about migrants at these two levels. The state wants to show it has power, and neoliberalism wants to show that the best way to protect finance from labor is to look at migrants as the enemy. And therefore, identity, I mean, it's at the same time the justification of neoliberalism, which has no justification otherwise, and it's a way to go back to, we don't like these people. But of course, we're living in 2024, and the human rights and democracy can't accept the fact that we say some people have more rights than others. So nativism, that emphasis on assimilation, that claim that some migrants won't fit in because they don't fit in the definition some members of the society arbitrarily defined as the core identity of the nation, ends up with, okay, they're at the bottom of the society, assimilation is impossible, we won't assimilate them. And we have our justification. So it's a process of institutions, it's a process of very powerful forces on international markets, and it's a process of there is no need anymore to justify why equality is not the most important element of what makes a democracy stand.
This leads us from the notion of nativism to the discussion on democracy. If nativism gives rights and privileges to ones over the others, then the question is, what is the consequence for democracy? We should put the principles of equality and inclusion and the protection of minorities at the center. So what do current debates on migration and policy responses tell us about the state of democracy nowadays in Europe?
Well, the debates on migration tell more about democracy and us as a global whole society than they tell about migrants and minority groups, that's for sure. You know, democracy is based on many things, but also on political thinking, and you have classics in the liberal philosophy, people like Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a lot about, you know, there is a risk with democracy, which is the tyranny of the majority. So how in societies based on the rule of the majority decide for the rest of the society, how can we control that majority is not becoming a tyrant? With nativism, with this idea that some citizens are less valuable than others, this basis of the democratic thinking is totally reversed. And I can speak about the French context, but you have now people making claim about a so-called tyranny of minorities, which is to say that anyone making claims about social justice, racial justice, sexual justice, environmental justice are picky people who are just endangering what I call the cultural identity of the nation. These are woke people, and don't just remember that the anti-woke debate is very coming from the alt-right in the US, so it's very reactionary trend in the current debates. And this notion of a tyranny of minorities makes no sense. A minority is not a matter of numbers, right? Minority is a matter of politics. I mean, in South Africa, black people were the minority as they were the most numerous population, whereas the whites, which were a minority group in numbers, were having the power to make the black people behave. So speaking about the tyranny of minority, it's just pretending that those who don't have power are imposing their power on those who have power. And there are many people who buy it, who buy this claim, because they are so sensitive about what they are told about the risk in the future of identities of the nation, and particularly where it concerns Muslims and Islam.
Mm-hmm. Let me pose the question more directly. You have written an article for Metropolis, that's the journal of the municipality of Barcelona, the cultural journal, and there you refer to 3 fractures. Could you explain it a little bit more, what you mean by this and how this relates to current discussions on migration?
That's a tricky question. I mean, it was easy to write.
It was not planned, but...
It was easy to write. It's less easy to summarize the argument. I feel that democracy, the way we've been used to think about it, is now being modified, shifted, by 3 trends. One trend is what you referred to in terms of the culturalization of citizenship. Mm-hmm. And this is something very important because if you look at the Netherlands or France or many other European countries, I'm more aware about the situation of Spain. I'm sorry, but what were held as being principles of democratic citizenship, laïcité, secularism, equality, emancipation, are now used as totem of identity. In the name of laïcité in France, in the name of secularism, people make claim about we can't have non-Christian, non-white, non-French-looking people among us. Mm-hmm. So they develop, because of this culturalization of citizenship, a notion of belonging which is very nostalgic towards a past that never was, a past before immigration, a past of a very smooth colonial period and experience, which was, of course, not the case. So that's the first trend. The second trend is that it's not anymore about the kind of, the electoral battle about we prefer to have a left-oriented policy in terms of labor, education, health, etc., as opposed to a more right-wing oriented. It's not anymore a battle about how society should be organized. It's a moral battle now between 2 parts of societies. I can speak about that for the French case, but also in the US. If you think after the election of Biden, Trump and his supporters refused to accept Biden's victory in the election. And it's as if there were not only politics, but there were 2 different societies fighting against each other. Mm-hmm. So in the US, for example, they do not even agree on what is the date of the foundation of the US now. And the moral polarization makes that we cannot agree, we disagree. Mm-hmm. If you disagree, it's you're on the bad side. Mm-hmm. You're ostracized. You cannot have a say. You're on the bad side. And I think it's also a very important trend that politics are about morals now. It's not about electoral battles. And in the end, nativism, this hierarchy among citizens that should be treated on an equal foot, but that is now based and justifying the hierarchy of the good citizens versus the bad citizens, mm-hmm. who are members of minority groups. Mm-hmm. And the 3 trends makes a dramatic situation for the future of democracy, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. Let me now shift to the so-called national models of integration. You have written quite a lot on this. Yeah. In fact, there is a huge literature, academic literature, talking and referring and analyzing and discussing these different national models of integration. To give you a few examples, the UK and the Netherlands have been posed as examples of multiculturalism. France is the illustration, the best example of an assimilationist model. And then we would have Germany, which could be, at least then, in the 80s or 70s, 80s, an example of the so-called Gastarbeiter model, meaning a model based on the separation between migrants who are thought and seen as temporary workers and natives or citizens more in general. You yourself, you have written quite a lot on this, and you have been quite critical on this concept. You have...
Guilty.
Sorry?
I'm guilty. Yeah.
You have problematized the concept. You argue that the concept of national models of integration does not explain change. You also argue that it's more a kind of narrative, a discourse, a political stereotype, a policy concept, and this happens quite often, that we academics use concepts that are in fact policy concepts and all become mixed up. So you argue that it's a narrative, it's highly normative, it's a political policy context, and you also argue that in fact this concept does not explain the whole. It may explain policy frames, it may explain ideas, it may explain policy paradigms, but not necessarily the policies and the policy practices behind. So in other words, what you argue is that the reality is much more complex than that. But another argument to criticize these so-called national models of integration is that in fact, most of these European countries are becoming closer and closer. Their integration policies are becoming closer. So there is a convergence trend. There are several academics that argue this. And my question is, are there still significant differences among European countries, basically related to this definition of the nation, this definition of us, which still is quite different from country to country? Netherlands, the UK, Germany, France, but then we could include as well Southern Europe, which is quite absent in all these debates, but we should bring in as well Spain, Italy, Greece. Are there still significant differences?
Let me turn the question the other way around. I mean, there is one country, there is one only Western country in the world which organized something which you could see as cultural accommodation, which is typical of multiculturalism, right? And this accommodation took the form of organizing every year the pilgrimage of Muslim soldiers to Mecca. So we can play a game. What is this country? You know, so we have traditionally in international cross-national comparisons, so-called multicultural countries like the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, the US. You have assimilation, universalism, I don't know how to characterize it, but that's France. And many other types, let's say. This country is France. I mean, the only country on earth among the Western countries who did the most accommodative practice for their members of the armed forces of religious Muslim faith is France. So how can you make it coherent with the notion that France is assimilationist and gives no room for cultural accommodation? That's one way to put it. The second way to answer your question is with Jan Willem Duivendak, who was supposed to be with us today, and unfortunately couldn't make it for personal reasons. We've been working a lot on comparing debates and controversies about Islam and Muslims in the Netherlands and in France. So here you have the most opposed countries if you look at them through the lenses of national models, right? The Netherlands with this notion of there being a multicultural country and France being France. Debates on laïcité, on secularism in France, analyzed very, very closely, show exactly the same narratives, the same criteria, the same framing than debates in the Netherlands about multiculturalism. Exactly the same. Yeah. So, in the name of laïcité in France, you will have people making claims that Muslims can fit because they are backward people, very reactionary people, very opposed to emancipation of the woman, to the emancipation of sexual minorities. You have exactly the same claims made in the Netherlands about Muslims. And I remember, for example, there was a public poll published in a news daily a few years ago in the Netherlands, saying that so there was a poll among Muslims in the Netherlands about how they felt about same-sex marriage. And the result was 52% of those Muslims that had answered the poll were in favor of same-sex marriage. Mm-hmm. And all the headlines in the newspaper said, you see, 48% of the Muslim people are opposed to same-sex marriage. Mm-hmm. I would have liked at the same time that we do the same poll not among French Muslims, but among the French people. Mm-hmm. And if you remember in 2012, there were a huge demonstration against same-sex marriage. Mm-hmm. And in the demonstration against that reform, there were no Muslims. There were only Catholic and white people. So it's just under the pretense of Muslims don't fit that in the end, nativist conceptions of citizenship take place everywhere, irrespective of what had been their national tradition. Mm-hmm. So to put it short, national models don't explain anything, but people believe in it. So let's look at what they do when they believe in it, and they discuss about in France, they will discuss about laïcité in hospitals, in schools, in public debates, but everyone will have its own understanding. And over time, it's changing. Laïcité 25 years ago meant that you had the right to wear a headscarf in public school, because what was seen as the most important norm was the religious freedom over laïcité, even in public schools in France. Today, it's the opposite. In the name of laïcité, we ask even that Muslim women don't be veiled in the streets, which makes no sense. So it's important to understand what sense people make of these notions, and when you look at that, you understand that they put so many different meanings attached to assimilation, to multiculturalism, that in the end, it's all blurred and you can't understand a thing. These anti-discrimination policies in France today are challenged because it would be foreign to the French national tradition, mm-hmm. because it would belong to multiculturalism. But no, fighting against discrimination is just guaranteeing the minimal fundamental freedom of anyone, equality. Mm-hmm. So claiming that anti-discrimination is a matter of multiculturalism first shows that you don't understand multiculturalism at all. Second, it might mean that multiculturalism is not what we thought it would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I was in the Netherlands, and that was in the 2000, all this discussion was taking place, and you were one of the leading scholars writing on this. And my question was, where does Spain fit, and where is Southern Europe in the whole discussion? It would not be fair to ask you where Spain fit in this discussion, but let me answer for you. And let me in order to answer this question, let me go back to these discussions, and particularly to the discussions that were taking place in the Netherlands in the 2000. I remember, as I said at the beginning, I said this in Catalan, I don't know whether you understood it, but I said that in 2004, when Theo van Gogh was murdered, the Volkskrant titled the first page with the title Trouble in Paradise. Everybody was in shock, also all my professors there. What happened in the Netherlands? It was perceived, seen as a paradise. They were living in a paradise. That's how they perceive it. And all of a sudden, they wake up. That was the impression. And the question all the time was why? Why did the Netherlands, a multiculturalist country, a leading country, an example of very inclusive policies, which were not called multicultural policies, but yet they were quite inclusive in terms of cultural difference. And the question was why? And the answer that was given by Dutch scholars, among them Jan Willem Douwendijk, who could not be here today, was that, in fact, it had to do with the fact that the definition of the nation, the Dutch nation, had changed. Till the 80s or the 70s, the Dutch society was divided in pillars. So it was structured based on religious identity. Basically, the Protestants and the Catholics, they did not marriage among them. They went to different schools. They had different newspapers. So they were really living apart. So when the migrants came, they were mostly invited, or they came from the colonies. They just set up a third and a fourth pillar. So it was easy to accommodate this diversity because it was one among others, and they were already diverse somehow. That was the explanation. But then in the 80s, there was a process of laicization, and there was a new definition. The nation was redefined, and was redefined in terms of liberal values. Who is Dutch? What it means to be Dutch. It was not anymore being Protestant and being Catholic. It was about sharing the same liberal values, meaning being in favor for same-sex marriages, being in favor of euthanasia, and all these let's say, liberal values that for them was key in the definition of the nation. So, and that's what happened, the Muslims turned to be the others because they were the ones that were perceived as not sharing the same values. Which means, and I think that this is a sentence coined by Jan Willem Douwendijk, that liberal values were used for illiberal purposes, meaning to exclude a rather important part of the population, because Dutch Muslims are more than 1 million in a 16 million country, which is quite a lot. So this was the discussion, and in this discussion I was wondering all the time where we are, Spain. Italy and Greece, I think that are quite quite different story, but I would say that in our case, Spain is not, let's say, a finished or well-functioning nation. Nobody knows who we are. There is a battle here, and there was a battle particularly since 2012 here in Catalonia. And all this battle, all this discussion, who we are, us against the others, the others were internal others, not external others, were not the migrants. So in all this discussion, we were discussing who we were, the Catalans, the Basques, Madrid, etc. So in all discussion, during all this discussion, migration took place in a quite important numbers. Now in Catalonia, 21% of the population is born outside the country, outside Spain. And in Spain is 14%, which is quite high. And it's quite new because they were born. It's not that we're not talking about second or third generations. So I would say that that's the reason why immigration up to now was not politicized. Basically because we were discussing among us. And this explains why the attacks in Atocha in 2004 and the terrorist attacks in Barcelona in 2017 were not an issue in terms that the response was not similar to the response in France. Nobody called for the war in terror. The Muslims, well, of course, there is Islamophobia. I'm not saying that there is no Islamophobia here. There is a long tradition of Islamophobia in Spain. But what I mean at the political level, it was not the case because, in fact, after 2017, the discussion was between the Catalan police and the Spanish police. And that was the issue at that moment. But now things are changing. And the question is why? But I leave it here. I continue with a question to you.
If I may, very shortly.
Yes.
All what we've been saying till now in this discussion shows something that is very difficult to grasp. And you refer to what Jan Willem said about using liberal values for illiberal objectives.
Yeah.
Today, in the name of progress, social progress, we justify exclusion. We justify racism. We justify Islamophobia. Because we accuse some people we decided arbitrarily that they would be the target, are seen as not progressive enough. And therefore we lost what allies we can have if progressive forces are also endorsing this kind of racist stance. And I think that's what is in common among European countries, irrespective of their different migration history, national history. Today we are lost because the long-standing opposition between progressive forces and identitarian forces, those playing the card of the identity, nationalism, etc., are converging. So citizens are lost. They don't know anymore for whom to vote because everything has become ambivalent. This is very, very strong in France, and I'm sure that there is a name because it's not only about the extreme right. I know we will be discussing about the extreme right in a minute, but it's also about social democrats. And social democrats are very, very, very active in this field of developing nativism as a program to define belonging to a democratic society, which is a neoliberal society in their understanding. One name you might know here in Barcelona is Manuel Valls.
Sure, we know him.
So Manuel Valls is typically one identity entrepreneur who come from the social democrat tradition. So it's not anymore about the right versus the left or the extreme right versus humanist voices. It's also so-called progressive forces that are playing the anti-immigration card and the Islamophobic card. And you refer to the Netherlands, and that was the case too. Frits Bolkestein, who started the politicization of the multiculturalism as a problematic issue in the Netherlands, comes from this social democratic tradition. So it blurs entirely the left versus right opposition, and I think that's also a very great cause for concern.
Yeah. Before we go more in depth into this issue, let's go back to the past, because I think that we cannot finish this conversation without referring to colonialism and decolonization. In his speech as a winner of the Weston International Award, a speech that he gave in September at the Royal Museum of Ontario, and which was published in El País last weekend, Pankaj Mishra said literally, and here I'm quoting him directly, "There is no doubt that if there is an analytical framework capable of explaining a wide variety of national and international phenomena, from the rise of Chinese nationalism and the far right in the West, to the culture wars in Europe and North America, the riots in US universities over Gaza, the divisions in Pan America, it's that of decolonization. And following his words, I would say that if there is an analytical framework capable of explaining our current debates on immigration, is as well colonization and decolonization, basically because both are related to the definition of the nation, to how we define us versus them. And let me start, or let me say a few things about this. Let me start with colonization. Achille Mbembe explained how colonization divided the world conceptually in two. He argues that democracy was built as the other side of the plantation, as the other side of the colonial plantation, which means as the other side of slavery and the colonial empire. And this, I'm following Achille Mbembe, created two different symbolic orders. One, which is that of the community, of people we recognize as close to us, as being part of us, and the second order, which is related to the community of others, the ones who are left out, who are perceived either as pure labor or as pure surplus. And he continues, he said, it's more than that, it's not just two symbolic orders. These two symbolic orders leads us to a division between the human and the subhuman. And it's precisely this division, this separation between the human and the subhuman, which justified the brutality of slavery and also the extreme violence of colonial armies during the independence struggles. And this, in fact, has to do with the denial of humanity, which was denounced as well by Frantz Fanon. So I would say that this is key, but also decolonization and decolonization processes are also key in how we define who we are, how we define the nation, how we define us. It's true that decolonization led the so-called Global South to start questioning, let's say, the hegemonic epistemologies of the North, but at the same time, the processes of decolonization led to a redefinition of European nations. That was the case in the UK, where the devolution of the empire put at the center the notion of belonging, which for the first time was defined in terms of birth and ancestry, so introducing an ethnic marker. And I would say that this was also the case in France, but correct me if I'm wrong. During colonial times, French citizenship was understood in rather open terms. The French colonial regime operated on the principle that the colonized could be assimilated in the future and thereby could become one day full citizens, but that was only a possibility. They were potential citizens, or they were included as potential citizens, but excluded, de facto excluded. No? That's how it worked. And here I'm following an advice you gave me a year ago to read a book on the invention of the decolonization. And this book, the author explains how the case of Algeria was very unique. The expansion of citizenship rights to the so-called Algerian Muslims was seen as a way to make the ties with Algeria stronger. Thus, to put it in few words, Algerians were given free entry to France and equal rights to French citizens, to be reminded that they were an integral part of the French, not nation, but an integral part of France, that they did not have the right to become independent. But this changed with independence, as it happened in the UK. With no colonies, there was no need to use migration policies as a means to strengthen the empire. And then the definition of the nation changed, though, or despite republicanism, I would say that it became more and more defined in cultural or mainly, maybe as well, ethnic terms. So here my question for you, what's the legacy of colonialism in shaping current debates about migration?
Well, it's a layer, it's a very important layer, that's no discussion about that, but with different impacts depending on the countries. For example, if you look at the Netherlands, the most stigmatized minority groups are not post-colonial migrants. They are guest workers from Morocco, particularly. Post-colonial migrants come from Suriname and Indonesia, and they are not stigmatized per se. I don't say that they are not facing racism, but the stigma goes to guest workers. So in that case, and we know that the Netherlands have done a lot of work on the memory of colonization and decolonization, so it's not absent of the public and social representations. But the stigmas go to guest workers, and the colonial legacy is not playing that key role. In the case of France, it's quite the opposite. You mentioned, well, you gave a very accurate and short summary of the situation, but the situation you described came only very late in the colonization by France of Algeria. And by the way, Algeria was not a colony, it was a département, which means that Algeria was part of the French metropolis, the mainland. It was not like other sub-Saharan colonies. It was, and yet that's where the French Republic made a division between subjects, colonial subjects, that is Muslims, Algerians, and citizens, that is the settlers, the European settlers. And only very late, they gave, only after the Second War, they gave full citizenship to the Algerians, but it was too late. And after the independence of Algeria, it's true, there was a free movement between France and Algeria. So things are very ambivalent. And today there are many disputes about whether we should, I mean, that's crazy discussions about, yes, but there were some positive aspects in the French colonization of Algeria. We brought hospitals, we brought trains, etc. But there is also a refusal by those saying that it was also something that led a very strong suffering among those who are today's immigrants in France, and to new French citizens, or not so new French citizens, those who have been citizens for 3 generations. So it's at the same time there, different impacts, but no work on the memory of that. It's a very, very fragile and sensitive issue. People don't want to go into that. So migration is somehow related, but not necessarily directly connected to colonization. But colonization and decolonization, of course, are very important, because there are times when we assume that it was justified that people were treated like non-humans.
We are running out of time, and then we will have 15 minutes for questions or comments. So let me pose one last question, and I have to choose among the remaining ones. And my question is, or let's say, let me start by saying that Europe is at stake. There are 2 comparisons that are extremely painful. The first one is the comparison between the European response to the 2015 refugee reception crisis and, on the other hand, the arrival of more than 5 million Ukrainian refugees in 2022. While in 2015, Europe said it was enough, to a little bit more than 1 million refugees, in 2021, Europe didn't even perceive it as a crisis. The Temporary Protection Directive was activated immediately, which means that they were given protection, Ukrainian refugees were given protection and access to social rights and to the labor market without any hesitation and on a group basis. This is the first comparison that is painful. The second comparison that is painful is the comparison between the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. In Ukraine, Russia's invasion has caused widespread destruction, has displaced more than 6 million people, and killed more than 10,000 civilians. In Gaza, as you all know, Israeli military operations have killed more than 41,000 civilians.
And probably more.
Sorry?
And probably more.
And this directly, then, there are the indirect deaths, and have pushed almost 2 million people out of their houses, so 2 million displaced people. While the EU, the European Union, supports Ukraine, it has remained silent and connivant towards the invasion in Gaza. So these double standards, which we all are not new, we all know about them, I would say that do a great deal of damage to Europe. Externally, it confirms the double standards of Europe, questions its legitimacy, and discredits its role on the international level. But then internally, and my question goes in this direction, it reminds, this double comparison reminds European citizens, which are much more diverse than what we imagine, that the imagined community, it reminds European citizens, particularly European dark-skinned Muslim citizens, that we are not always, or we are not always all equal. So I was wondering, what is the debate in France? How is it seen there? Does it represent yet another fracture, or another social fracture in the sense that extreme tension? What does it mean internally?
Well, the first tip is, to answer your question, is that if we were in France, I wouldn't answer the question.
Well, here the situation in Spain is much freer in this sense.
It's
Maybe nobody would pose you this question in France.
Oh, yeah, but it would be a trap.
Ah.
No, the debate is impossible, asymmetrical, and unjustified. So, it's if you don't start speaking about October the 7th, you don't have a say. And of course, I mean, October the 7th is something, but history of that situation is much longer. And so, an impossible debate in France with a, I don't know if I'm recorded, but there is kind of intimidation of those who have a different say about the situation and different understanding of the situation. And why is that so? Well, many reasons. International relations, the relationship with Israel. I won't enter into that. But maybe just to grasp what is at stake in this discussion, I would say it's a nexus between what Edward Said called Orientalism. So it's a way to look at the Arabs, because we're not talking about the Chinese when we are speaking about Orientalism. The Arabs are unique, singular, specific, different, and therefore we can treat them in a very singular, different, and unique way, which is not necessarily on an equal part. So Orientalism plays a huge role in the framing of who are the Gazawi and their support. On the other hand, you have the other face of the same reality, which is Occidentalism. Occidentalism is the way that the West or the global North is looking at Israel as a member of the West among an ocean, a sea of non-democratic countries. So there is this fight under the pretense that it's the Western civilization which is at stake, and that's no discussion to have about it. So Orientalism downgrade the Gazawi, Occidentalism upgrade the opposite forces, and the asymmetry just justifies what we see, which is unjustifiable. That's my understanding of the situation.
Yeah, you explain it very well and very clear. And so it was 1 hour conversation. We did it. And now we have 15 minutes for comments, questions. You can post them in English, in Catalan, in Spanish. I'll translate.
French.
Or maybe you in French too as well. So feel free. We have a microphone there. We'll take several comments and then back to Christophe or to us. If you can introduce yourself.
Hi, well, my name is Camilo. Thank you so much for your conference. So I have a question. When we talk about migration here in Europe, there is a lot of controversy, especially when we talk about migration, assimilation, integration. We often refer to immigrants that come from the Middle East, from Northern Africa, from a Muslim background. But at the same time, Europe experiences different migration waves from within the European Union, from other Western countries, from countries like the UK, Russia, Ukraine. But these migratory groups are not often referred as immigrants, but as expats. So my question is, do you think there is a classist, colorist narrative when we talk about migration? Why when we talk about the first group, about Muslim immigrants, African immigrants, they're always immigrants. But when we talk about other immigrants, they are not always immigrants. We call them expats. We say, oh no, they don't need to integrate. So yeah, that's my question.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Other comments, questions? Otherwise, I have more questions.
I know it's depressing, this discussion, but...
No, so then I have another question. While you think about other possible comments and questions, let me pose what it was my last question, but I did not have to pose it. And the question is, what can we do to reverse these trends? What could be the alternative? And in this way, we may end up our discussion in a more positive way. But before going back to Christophe, are there other comments in Catalan or in Spanish as well? Questions?
Okay.
So Christophe, yes.
Well, thank you for your question. You've been brave because you were the only one asking a question, so bravo. Of course, the migrant is socially, publicly, politically, economically, mediatically, always the non-white. And Johnny Depp lives in France, in the south of France. He is not seen as a migrant, although he is. So yes, there is always an ethno-racial subtext to that word, immigrant, migrant, immigration. And the comparison between the Ukrainian, the entry of Ukrainians, 6 million in 2022, made no political crisis within the EU. Orban said nothing. And even these flows of population were not framed as an immigration issue. Whereas in 2015, it was 6 times less people entering, and they were causing the most important crisis within the EU to date. And Orban was very vocal in the way he was replaying the battle against the Ottoman Empire. And for him, it was very, very strong. So color, ethnicity, the South, if you're white, if you come from the global North, and if you're wealthy, you're not a migrant in the social perception or the political debate. When the Taliban took power in Afghanistan, the first thing Macron said on television to the French citizens was, okay, we have to be prepared to a migration crisis again. Wow. Now, what can we do? Well, if people knew what can we do to solve that issue, he would win the Nobel Prize. And I think I have no chance, so my answer will be very limited. But if I go back to what I tried to say in the introduction of our discussion, I think there is a link between neoliberalism and anti-immigration politics. It's the finance telling to the labor that the labor is losing because of the migrants, not because of the finance. That's a very short summary, of course. But maybe, and you will maybe be shocked by what I'm about to say, maybe finance is the solution. Why? There is a development at the global level, and it's happening within the EU as well, so all EU member states are concerned, by which it's not only the financial value of a company that must be demonstrated and assessed, but also the non-financial value of a company, a private company, meaning social responsibility, what is the impact of a company in its social environment. And it goes up to 5 levels of I'm not that used to speaking in English about these issues, but those giving the supplies that a company needs, so 5 levels, and 5 levels of prestataires, I don't know how you say that, people who work for you. So it's 10 levels by which you have to prove that you do no harm, your company do no harm on your social environment, okay? What if we put racism and anti-discrimination in the criteria used to assess, to evaluate the social responsibility of companies? So that's something I try to do in France now, with a new charter for companies, with a new norm, etc. And I think the market is the problem, but maybe we can use the market to make progress towards a solution.
Well, this is a very concrete answer. We still have 7 minutes, and I think that there is still one question. Emilia? We need the microphone here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Emilia.
Louder. Yeah?
Okay. Yes.
No.
So my question is concerning about, like, right now we're talking how migration is going to be increasing, and there's going to be like a possible crisis and with all this talk. Therefore, countries are probably going to start being harsher in their migration policies and accepting migrants. And do you think that that's going to cause like probably more illegal migration, and that's going to be harder socially maybe to integrate afterwards due to the illegal immigration, and it's going to become like a cycle? So what would be your response to that issue? Thank you.
Thank you.
Because of the acoustic, I couldn't hear. So were you better situated?
Not really. Can you repeat your question?
No,
Yes.
it's really about the acoustic.
Yes, of course. So I was saying that migration is a big issue right now, and they're going to be countries are going to be harsher with the policies, meaning that migrants not going to let migrants in. So therefore, there's going to be a lot of illegal migration because people aspire for a better life. So I think that it's going to be like a cycle with the illegal migration, and then countries are going to be even more harsher. So what would you say is the response to that?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. What is the main driver of illegal immigration? It's European migration policies. I mean, it's because of the rules and criteria used by the member states and the EU that you have people falling into the category of irregular migration. And the more we go, the stricter the rules and the policies. Makes no sense, and it can't last forever. So let's be a little optimistic that at some point politicians will realize that. Because if they do that, if they have stricter migration policy which drives more and more people into irregular situations, it's under the pretense that it's what's expected from them by their electorate, by their public opinion. And in the case of France, it's very striking. The more we go, the more the Rassemblement National, the extreme right-wing party, is very successful in elections. But we have also indexes that evaluate the level of tolerance in society, including tolerance vis-à-vis immigrants and minority groups. And this is an indicator that has been there, so we can compare over time, since 1998. And the more we go, the more tolerance is growing. So my hypothesis, and that's the hypothesis of colleagues also, is this discrepancy cannot last forever. Anti-immigrant politics is the result of the projection of some politicians about a mistaken understanding of what the population is expecting. And there are other factors that explain why people are supporting extreme right-wing parties, aside this issue of identity, multiculturalism, and migration. Maybe you know Zaitouni Oyando. Someone know Zaitouni Oyando? No? She's the best example that one can be at the same time or going through all the categories that exist in migration policies. She was an asylum seeker, and then she was an irregular migrant, illegal migrant, clandestine migrant. Then she was expelled from the US. Then she came back because she was suffering persecution in Kenya. And she finally became a refugee and worked as an NGO benevolent. Do you know who was Zaitouni? She was the aunt of Barack Obama. So even the aunt of the president, and during his mandate, so even the aunt, the sister of the father of the president of the first power on earth can be an irregular migrant in the country her nephew is the president of. I think it shows the absurdity of the situation. And this is not what people want, so let's work harder on voicing that exclusion, that inequality, that racism, that Islamophobia, and that Mediterranean being a symmetry is not a viable solution on the long term.
Thanks, Christophe. We have another question there, but we do not have time. We only have 1 minute extra, so you can ask it directly to Christophe afterwards. So let me finish where we started. At the beginning, I said that these kind of spaces were really needed, that we needed to discuss, to put context, to put this long perspective, to stop and stop reacting and open these spaces for common discussion, and that's what we did. Thank you very much, Christophe, for having come to Barcelona, for being here at la Biennal de Pensament. And now let me finish by saying that, I will say it in catalan, a les 7:30 tenim una nova sessió titulada Ciutats i metròpolis, transformacions urbanes i noves dinàmiques socials i culturals, amb Joan Subirats, que com tots sabeu, i pels joves estrangers que no ho saben, és el fundador d'aquesta fantàstica Biennal de Pensament, i Alessandro Balducci. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Moltes gràcies.